I would say that we come into our prime at 50. It's when we become the women we always wanted to be. And so I think that we need to really change the story that we tell about women and becoming, and start thinking that 50 is actually, the beginning of that queen age period between 50 and 75, where that's when we really reap the benefits of this long life that we've had and everything that's come before.
Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of Life Uncut. I'm Laura.
I'm Brittany.
And I am so excited for today's interview because whilst we were interviewing this fabulous, amazing woman, I honestly did not want the conversation to stop. Her name is Eleanor Mills. And for those of you who do not know who she is, Eleanor is an award-winning journalist. She's an editor and a broadcaster. And now she has created the community called Noon. But prior to that, Eleanor was the editorial director of the Sunday Times and editor of its magazine for 23 years. Now, the big thing that we're talking about in this episode is this almost like midlife crisis that Eleanor went through. Well, it's not really a crisis, is it? She was made redundant at the age of 49.
Out of the blue, was not expected.
And had to go through the very real realization of what does life look like when you reach quote unquote middle age.
Eleanor calls it the midlife clusterfuck. We talk about our perceived value as we age and a lot of the motivators and values that we hold as career-driven women.
This is a conversation around how the media especially puts an expiration date on women. This idea that we have the currency of what a woman is worth and what she can contribute. Eleanor is completely rewriting this conversation, and she describes the years of her life now in her 50s after much self-work as the most incredible years of her life, as her now finally living her prime.
Eleanor, welcome to Life Uncut.
Hello, very nice to be here.
Very nice to have you here. Also, it's 7:30 in the morning where you are, is that correct?
It's quite early in the mornings and not really my forte.
You're doing very well. We start every episode the same, and that is with an accidentally unfiltered story. Your most embarrassing story. It's a good place to start. And you just said you thought you had one that was quite embarrassing.
Well, it's also about getting up in the morning.
Perfect.
This particular... Perfect, exactly. So this particular morning, I was in Cannes at the advertising festival, and I was staying in the most kind of glorious modern villa, high above the harbour. You can see, so the whole of kind of ad world media land is spread out in front of you. The cicadas are beeping, lambdas. I've got the most terrible hangover ever. I've probably drunk my body weight in rosé, and I stagger up the stairs, and I kind of look out, and I'm so groggy that I stagger towards what I think is the door and whack my head so hard on the glass, because it's one of those kind of swanky glass villas, that I see stars. I literally think I'm going to pass out, and I'm feeling pretty dreadful anyway. And my entire senior leadership team, most of the most senior people at News UK, are sitting outside on the terrace having breakfast, hear me thump my head on the front, and they all stagger into the kitchen, where I'm like literally holding my head like this, kind of trying to pretend that I'm all right, when actually I think I've got concussion. So that was pretty bad. That was like, me definitely making a prat of myself.
I mean, you had me at a holiday full of rosé. I think that makes up for the whole thing, does it not?
There'd been an extremely large amount of rosé drunk the night before, and I just couldn't see that it was glass. It was one of those places that you probably have loads of them in Australia. That's my vision of Australia anyway, all those kind of modern glass kind of houses overlooking the beach. So I was kind of thinking, hey, I'm queen of all I survey. Thump.
I have such strong memories of being a little kid and sitting on our lounge in the back house. And my stepmom, I was playing with some fabric. She was a dressmaker at the time, and she saw from outside, and she ran inside to get it off us because it was important fabric to her. She ran in at pace and went face first into the back door and broke her nose. So it happens. And she wasn't even drunk. So don't worry. You're amongst good company here.
We've all been there. Eleanor, you were working for Rupert Murdoch for the best part of 25 years. You've been in the industry a very long time. Can you talk to us back at the start of your career? How did you find yourself in this world?
It's a really great question. So I was fortunate enough to go to Oxford University, and I graduated with a degree, my shiny degree in English. And my dad wanted me to be a management consultant, and I was really not very keen on that for obvious reasons, like it sounded really dull. And I really wanted to write and be a journalist.
It sounded boring as fuck.
It sounded boring as fuck. And I kind of grew up in quite a kind of political family. My stepmother was a politician. She was in Tony Blair's cabinet. So there were quite a few people around us who kind of, ran things. Sorry, that makes me sound very plutocratic. I'm not really. But one of my dad's friends tried to try and save me from being a management consultant, was like, oh, well, you can come and do some work experience on The Guardian if you want. That was what it was like back in the day. So I did, and I was 21, and I never looked back. It was one of those things with those kind of openings that somebody can get you a foot in the door. But I think I was a born journalist. I'm very nosy. I'm quite chatty. I had good contacts. I've always liked to write. And what journalism gives you is that kind of amazing front row seat on history, that, you know, you really are there. You get to write the first draft. And I just love that. I love the knowing and the being in the loop.
With this, I mean, you were one of the youngest editors at the time. So then when you've worked in such a high profile position and built yourself up into this career, how important to you at that time was your career to your identity, to your sense of self-worth, to kind of how you positioned yourself, I guess?
Well, I think also, particularly when you start off very young, so I was a real wunderkinder kind of within the industry, because I was the features editor at another newspaper called The Telegraph by the time I was 26, and I was running the main bit of the comment and features part of the Sunday Times before I was 30.
Which is incredible. Like, you're brushing over that
Yeah,
very quickly. Like, then I had this really huge achievement when I was born. That's an incredible feat to do in your early 20s.
It was quite intense then. It was a very male world. I was often the only woman in meetings, always the youngest, always running people who were much older than me. But I had a lot of ideas, I think, and a lot of enthusiasm. And at that point, they were trying to reach a more kind of female audience as well. So they needed some women around the table. And I think it was just incredibly heady to be at the top table when people were deciding, right, who are we going to back for the election? You know, the Iraq War, I did American elections. I ran a lot of the big coverage after 9/11, all that kind of thing. It was a very exciting kind of heady time. And I'm married and I've got 2 kids. But I think that basically the main focus of my life for a quarter of a century was journalism, the paper, having the best stories, getting the best people to write for me. I ran the magazine. I was the Saturday editor. I was the editorial director. I really kind of ticked the boxes on those big journalism jobs. So I would say that was pretty much at the core of my identity.
I mean, when you say you're working in a male industry, why do you think you were the person that was chosen? When you do say
for the one female role,
and also so young, you would think if that's the case, there would be other women who may be older, more qualified. Like, what do you think it was about you yourself that kind of got you into those roles to start with?
I think. Okay, oh gosh, that's a hard one to say. I'm quite sharp and I'm quite good at kind of seeing to the centre of things. I get on with people. I don't scare easily. I think I really wanted it.
Yeah.
And I was prepared to put up with quite a lot of the kind of misogyny that went with being allowed in the huddle. You know, there was an assumption that you weren't going to be what they called missish, that you weren't going to kind of, someone made a kind of sexist joke, you weren't going to kind of, blush and run out of the room. You had to kind of give as good as you got. And I grew up with 6 brothers and I went to a big, what we call a public school here, a big male private school called Westminster from when I was 16. So I think I'd grown up in the belly of the beast of those kind of men, and they didn't frighten me.
Did you find you were taken seriously with your ideas? Did you challenge the men with their ideas? Did you feel like at any point you were a token female substitute at that table?
No, I don't think I was ever a token.
Mm-hmm.
I think anyone who spent 5 minutes in my company would know that I was never a token.
And I don't mean offence by that. I just know that back when we were starting, that's the world we lived in, right? Okay, we've got 25 men at the boardroom, we better throw a woman in. And it's nothing against you personally, but it was the world we were in.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think that might, they might think, oh gosh, we should have some female representation, but that won't keep you in the room very long, because the way that newspaper hierarchies work is that there are quite a few people who have quite big titles but aren't necessarily in the huddle. And what happens is that you'd have a kind of big conference where everyone would be invited, and then afterwards, 2 or 3 people would be called into the editor's office to really make the decisions. And I was in that huddle always for, 25 years. And I think, that has to be because you bring a kind of acuity to it. I think I was quite good fun, which I think is an under-repped kind of quality at work. That's quite nice to have people in the room who make life a bit more jolly. And I think I brought a different perspective. And I think I was also quite good at speaking truth to power. But I also think that there's something about being a young, kind of blonde, rather curvaceous woman, which also makes you rather kind of palatable to a whole group of top chaps.
Yes, unfortunately.
I mean, I have a whole theory that as women become less pleasing, both kind of physically and in terms of becoming more bolshy, which I think you certainly do as you get more senior, because I think you become less grateful just to be there and a bit more like, well, hang on, you've got to listen to what I say because I've won these prizes and actually my section's the most successful bit. You know, you become a bit less emollient about, or enthusiastic maybe about, you know, things that they want to do. So I think I became more bolshy. I was also chair of something called Women in Journalism for 7 or 8 years, and that involved me often challenging the status quo. You'd look down a news list and everybody on the news list would be a bloke who was doing something interesting, and then there'd be a few women who were probably victims, you know, who'd been murdered or something, or were arm candy. And I'd be like, well, where are the stories about women with agency? Where are the women doing something in their own right? And it was also increasingly hard to get pictures or stories about older women into the paper. And I think as I began to get older, I began to see that and go, hang on, there's something really fundamentally kind of, you know, unjust about this coverage. And that was one of the things that we did a lot of research on at Women in Journalism. So I think I probably became more motivated to challenge the status quo as I got more senior.
Eleanor, I saw this quote that you wrote, and this ties into that perfectly. You wrote, "Older women are very much the demographic the mainstream media forgot. One of the last bastions for diversity." When was it that you recognized this, and what was the response when you started to push against it and wanted to kind of get more coverage or more visibility?
Well, I can remember a really sorry, it's earlier here in the morning. I can remember a really key time when I was editing the magazine, and we had a photo shoot with an amazing. We'd had Charlotte Rampling, who is the incredible actress, and we'd had her shot in Paris in her 70s in black and white for the cover of the magazine. And I went up to the editor because I made most of the decisions, but he had to approve the cover. And I remember showing him the pictures of Charlotte Rampling and him going, "Oh God, can't we have a picture of her when she was younger? You know, like when she was in the Night Porter, when she was attractive." And I was like, well, no, the whole point is that she's now 70 and she's iconic, and we've had these incredible photographs shot. And it was that was really typical of it. I mean, I really had a battle. We did get the pictures on the cover, but it became increasingly difficult. I remember putting on the cover a picture of some of the girls who'd been kidnapped in Nigeria, the Chibok girls, and again having a real kind of fight about that, about people don't want to read about poor girls in Nigeria. There was a real battle often to get any kind of stories on the cover involving women who weren't kind of, you know, glammed up in that kind of traditional kind of media way. There's a lens, a male, what I call a male lens in the media about what they think is appropriate, what they think we should see. And I think that that's really obvious when it comes to the depiction of older women, that often the older women that we see on our screens don't look old at all. There are about two who are allowed to see who actually are old, like Judi Dench or Miriam Margolyes. Judi Dench because, you know, she's been M in Bond, and Miriam Margolyes because she's funny. And they're the kind of two who are allowed. But most of them are kind of, you know, identikit, kind of very cosmetically enhanced clones who don't really look like 50-year-old women at all.
I find this so interesting when you talk about like this male lens of viewership. I guess it's not just when we talk about like mainstream media in terms of, I'm talking pop culture, or when we talk about movies. We see it in sport in terms of like men thinking that, well, no one wants to watch women in sport. No one wants to watch older women in movies. And it's like almost this perceived expiration date that I think a lot of women put on themselves. And then it's very hard to, it's even as like your own self-talk, it's very hard to rework that and go, oh, well, being 40 is not scary, being 50 is not scary, because your whole life you've been told that, you know, you have an expiration date as a woman.
Yeah, I really hate that. I mean, that's one of the things that my book, which is called Much More to Come, is really trying to challenge. So men seem to age like silver foxes, you know, or fine wine, getting better with age. Whereas women in our culture are given an expiration date, what we call in England a sell-by date. And I think that women, as they age, are seen more like peaches, one wrinkle and we're done, you know. And that is the story that I am really trying to challenge, because that comes from that very narrow male lens view of what women are for. You know, patriarchy values women for being fecund, able to have children, and, you know, fuckable, you know, hot, fanciable, someone they might want to kind of go to bed with. So if you only see women through that male lens, then I think it's a bit like seeing women in black and white rather than in the kind of rainbow of colours that we really are. And once you take away that male lens and you say, actually, we're going to live and breathe in brilliant technicolor, you begin to see that women are not just about being kind of fecund and fuckable. They're about being creative or brave or funny or experienced or loving or, you know, all those other kind of rainbow colours of what women can be. So that's really what my book argues for. Because if you start seeing women through a rainbow lens, then they don't have an expiration date of, you know, any time at all, let alone 30 or 40 or 50.
The funny thing is, it's the media that's defining what fuckable is. Like, it just comes full circle. When you say women are seen as fuckable, it's the media, and not you, but like in general, in a very broad spectrum, the media is saying what is fuckable. Like, they're putting the definition on the covers. They're putting the leads in the movies and the TV shows. And they're who's saying, hey, if you don't look like this, then you're not fuckable.
Yes, but that's because of the male lens that the media has. So it's about changing that. First of all, it's about pointing it out and understanding it, because I think that that's a, you know, huge thing. Most people aren't even aware that that's going on. So pointing out a bit, I think we're a bit like lobsters being boiled in a pot. You know, we're kind of put in when it's quite kind of lukewarm, we don't realise, and it gets kind of hotter and we don't see it. So I think part of what my book's trying to do is to point out the kind of gendered ageism in our culture. And I think the purpose of doing that is not just so that women like me, I'm 53, feel better, but so that younger women don't feel like they've got this kind of terrible sell-by date coming at them. I think that by changing the story that we tell about older women in our culture, we also extend the runway for all women. And when I go and talk about my book, and I do a lot of public speaking, I see that it's not just the other, what I call queen agers in the room who are excited about what I'm saying, but the young women are too, because I think because of the tyranny of screens and Instagram and filters and all that kind of thing, that fear of aging is actually starting even earlier.
Oh my God,
and it's
it is, isn't
crazy. Yeah, and that's really scary. And then what's really crazy about that is the great benefit that we have from science, the kind of longevity dividend. Lifespans have doubled since 1900, so we're all living longer. So actually what women today have is this incredible period between 50 and 75 when we're still young, we're still lucky, healthy if we're lucky, where we've got some agency and maybe made some money because we're the first generation to have worked all the way through since we were 20 and we're now 50. And so we can actually have this golden period, our queen agerhood, where we can come into our power, pivot into purpose, do the things that we always wanted to do. I talk about becoming at 50 the woman you always wanted to be, and yet that story's not in our culture at all. And yet I see so many incredible women around me really fulfilling that paradigm. So that's what I really wanted to change.
Eleanor, I find this fascinating because I think also the problem is that we sometimes as women when we're young, we self-fulfill that prophecy without realizing, because you get the validation. It feels nice. You know, people tell you you're beautiful and you dress in a way that like acquires that validation. And then you hit an age where you're like, well, it's not coming as frequently. And then you start to pick out the things that are wrong with your face or the things that the world tells you should change or you should fix. And it's quite a rewiring that's required. And I'm curious as to whether it's a process that you experienced. Like, was there a time in your life where you recognized that you valued the youthful aesthetic and that sort of like male validation for what it was, and then realized as you got older that there wasn't the representation that you looked at yourself in the media or in the articles that you were writing and say, like, I don't see myself reflected back in this anymore, and it's so one-dimensional?
Yeah, I think that that's totally true. And I think that it's quite easy when you're young, particularly before you have any children, to think, oh, this is all rubbish, all this feminism stuff. The world's fine, you know, I'm getting this job, all these men are chatting me out, I seem to have all this power. But I think that what you realise, and I've got daughters, I've got a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old, is how fleeting and evanescent a power based on fecundity and fuckability is. You know, that if we go on valuing women only for those qualities, we're condemning them to a very brief kind of, you know, flowering shelf life. We're totally tapping into that patriarchal valuation or validation of what women are. So I also think it's important for younger women to realise the trap that they're walking into, and they do that by that being explained to them by women who have kind of, you know, walked the walk before. And also for all of us women to stop kind of doing that kind of divide and rule, pitting different kinds of women against each other, younger women against older women, and saying that we're all in this together. Actually, we're not going to be picked off and fight against each other. We need to support each other through this whole journey to be seen as rainbows, not in black and white. And that then helps all of us, you know, because it's only like patriarchy only works for a very small amount of men who happen to be at the top of the kind of, you know, the pinnacle. So actually the power that women get from playing up to patriarchy only works for a very short amount of time. So I'm arguing for a much more kind of equal view of what we do, and for women to understand the landscape which they're going into and to unpick it for themselves, so they also stop valuing themselves by the male lens, because there's so much internalized misogyny which is also stoked up by the media. If you think about the Daily Mail going on about women's kind of bingo wings or cankles or kind of, you know, defects that we never thought we even had, we didn't even know that we had, you know, all of that is often stoked by the media too. So as someone who's been in the belly of the beast of the media for 25 years as a woman, I'm trying to kind of point out how this thing works and how we can unpick, deprogram ourselves, if you like, from its tremendous power. And I think it's particularly important for our kids growing up in an internet age where it's even more pernicious, and with freely available online pornography, which completely, I mean, if you want to see the male lens in action, it's porn.
I'd love to take like a little deviation to something that you just said, Eleanor. And you did say you've been in the belly of the beast for 25 years. Women being pitted against women is something that we can't escape in the media. Even as women that are trying to support each other within it, we can't find a way out from media reporting on it because it's clickbait, it's what they love. And
there's always some female that's got a beef with another female. We thrive in the drama, don't we?
Well, that's what I want to ask. Over in the UK, we've seen it for so long now with the royal family. We've seen it a lot with Meghan Markle and Kate Middleton.
Yeah.
And as somebody that is there, assuming you're extremely patriotic, you are in the media, you are seeing it happen. What are your thoughts on the actual relationship between Meghan and Kate? But how do we escape that when the biggest and most famous family in the world and the two women that are at the helm, we're seeing them constantly, quote unquote, fighting and bickering? Like, how are the rest of us supposed to escape that and, I guess, grow in any form when that's what we're looking up to?
Well, I would say that the first thing to do is to kind of analyse the medium. You know, the medium is the message. If I go back to my old kind of critical theory that I studied at university. So you're seeing that catfight through the lens of the male media all the time, and that's the element of that relationship that the press has chosen to report because it fits into a narrative of women fighting against women. You know, exactly what I was saying about that kind of divide and conquer. I think you see it, I think with Meghan Markle and Kate, it was exacerbated by the racism in the British press.
Totally.
I'm on the record challenging that. I mean, one of the most egregious examples of it was Jeremy Clarkson's column about Meghan, where she compared her to that scene in Game of Thrones and said that she should be pelted with excrement and kind of walk through the streets while people shouted shame. I mean, I just thought that was outrageous. And I was Jeremy Clarkson's editor for 15 years. If Jeremy had filed me that column, I would have taken it out. I would have deleted the whole lot and gone back to him and gone, Jeremy, you've gone completely mad. I'm not running that. So, and I did that on numerous occasions because part of my job as Jeremy Clarkson's editor was to save him from himself. That's what editors do. You know, he's a kind of powerful, expensive franchise. You don't want him to shoot himself in the foot. So as his editor, you had the power to say, no, Jeremy, you've gone over the line. And I used to do it a lot. And actually, to be fair to Jeremy, he was always very nice about it. He kind of knew that often we were saving him from himself. So I was really shocked by that column because somebody could have stopped that. It's not like he was so powerful, nobody could have taken it out. So that made me think that within the kind of belly of that particular beast, either whoever was in charge was, you know, slacking on the job and didn't see it, or they intentionally let it through. And I would assume it was probably the latter. Yeah. But I think that then stokes a very misogynist, racist debate, which is becoming more polarised. I think it's even worse than, in some ways, when I was there now, because of the effect of kind of Twitter and online platforms. And it's almost like they're playing into a particular side of the culture war. So I just think it's really important that we point out where the kind of the goldfish bowl is, you know, in all of this, so that women can see it and understand how they're being manipulated. And when Kate is pitted against Meghan, that's a very intentional piece of media crafting. Women don't have to compete for the same space. We can all, there's lots of space in the world. We can all take it up and support each other. So I think it's a really unfortunate lens.
Do you think scarcity mindset, we talk about it a little bit on this podcast, but this idea of scarcity mindset.
There's not many royal positions, no, Laura.
No, but yeah, okay.
It's the scarce.
To be fair, we're not all going to be princesses. In some cases, there are some scarcities, but do you...
We're all princesses in our own way.
Deep inside.
Do you think it is a real thing in terms of job scarcity? Or you said like the pie is big enough, but do you think the pie is always big enough, or is it a case that we catastrophize it a little bit because we have been brought up and we're in this world where there is such internalized misogyny, there isn't enough seats at the table as women, and we seem to almost compete with each other sometimes in environments where it is our own undoing?
I think that women have been encouraged to compete against each other for the one seat at the table. In the past, there would be one seat at the table for a woman, so all women would be fighting for that. I think as we open up, we get more equal, and there are more places at the table for half the places at the table should be for women. Then hopefully women support each other into getting those roles rather than having to fight to be the only one there. And I do think that that's changing as you get more women kind of coming into professions. I mean, not always. We've all come across, senior women who don't behave in a collegiate way. There's still very much a kind of queen bee syndrome. I think a kind of hangover from, the effects of people like Margaret Thatcher, who define themselves in such a macho world as being exceptional, as being not like other women. There's a really interesting study done of the Dutch police, which showed that when there were very few women in the service, the women got on better by defining themselves as not like other women. But as the women became 30-40% of the service, the behaviour which was actually more helpful to them was to be more collaborative. So it's also, you're right, it's a kind of scarcity mindset, and hopefully as you get more women in, they behave in a more supportive way. But often I think the women who get to the highest echelons don't behave in that way. I was finally whacked at the Sunday Times by a woman who then got rid of 5 other senior female journalists when she came in to be the editor.
You are 49, working for the Sunday Times as an editor. When you get a knock on the door and it's goodbye, you get the boot. Can you talk us through what that...
Made redundant, one might say.
Well, it's pretty cooked. Like,
yeah.
I say get the boot because it sounds, as far as I know, pretty horrific. And I don't think we give them the respect of saying that. Like, you deserve the respect, they don't. But can you talk to us about what that time was like?
Yeah, it was really hideous. So we started off talking about this, about identity. And I think in some ways we're the kind of first generation of women who have had the kind of careers which allowed us to build an identity around work in a way that I think men have done for a long time. So to find myself, I've always been quite competitive. So I was still doing really well. My section was doing really well. The day that I was actually, made redundant from the paper, I could talk about being whacked. I had a global scoop, an interview with Sheryl Sandberg on the cover of the magazine that I edited, and it was International Women's Day. So that was all really rather ironic.
Oh my God, take your cupcake and go.
I told you it was the boot. There's no more of a boot than getting sacked by a woman on International Women's Day.
On International Women's Day with a kind of global scoop of an amazing woman on the cover of your magazine. Which I'd done myself. I'd been to Silicon Valley to interview Cheryl. It was my scoop. Anyway, so I got this call. I'd been out for lunch. I get a call going, oh, the new boss wants to see you. I'm like, okay, fine. So I go up there with like a whole file of all the stuff that I'm going to put in the magazine that I'm intending to run over the next 6 months. Walk in, and then I suddenly think, oh crikey, it's that meeting. You know, the meeting where there's tissues in the middle of the table and the head of HR is sitting next to the boss who's looking a bit shifty. And I suddenly thought, fuck, it's that meeting. Have you seen the movie or the series One Day, where there's one day in the we all have a day when we're going to die, right? But you have a kind of death day when you're at work, and you're suddenly like, oh, okay, I'm at my death day. This is when I die, kind of thing. And I remember sitting.
R.I.P. me.
It's such a good way of describing it, but it's true. Yes, absolutely.
It's so true. So I go in. There's the tissues. There are the 2 women looking shifty, and I just suddenly thought, okay, I'm for it. I'm going to get the bullet, because you also know in those kind of media companies that there's no way back. Once someone's decided that you're on your way out, it's a negotiation about what's your payoff, basically. But my brain just completely separated, a bit like when you're in a car crash or something. And so I was kind of aware that there was a conversation going on. People were like shuffling papers around, but my brain was just following this pigeon as it flew around the kind of spires of Southwark Cathedral. I could see a tugboat chugging up the Thames. I'd completely checked out, and I felt like I died. It was a really weird kind of out-of-body experience, because I knew that the life that I'd had was over, and that there was going to be a new chapter, a bit like when somebody dies and you know that there's no going back. So I just knew that this was the end of a period of my life, and that I was going to move into something else. And it was very funny. Even on that day, I was like, I'm not going to get another job in the media. I'm not going back. I didn't want to do what I had been doing somewhere else. And I was offered some other jobs, but I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to set up my own thing. So that was when I set up my media company, Noon, as in the middle of the day, because in the 100-year life, 50 is halfway through. So I set up noon.org.uk, which is all about helping women start a new chapter at 50. Of course, it wasn't quite as quick as doing it.
Of course. You weren't like watching the pigeon and the tugboat and you were like ready to do Noon now. Been thinking about this for a while. But I wonder, especially this idea of, and 49 is not old. It's not like we're sitting here going like, oh God, 49. But there must have been a sense of, what am I going to do for my next job? Like, what is the next thing at some point? And I guess when you, and you know, we've said identity a couple of times, but when so much of it is tied up in the work that you do and who you are and how you've shown up to this one place for work for so long, what did that do to your sense of identity, to your sense of knowing who you are or what you wanted?
It was pretty dark. I mean, it was like, I think when I was at the Sunday Times, I wore what I kind of describe in the book as a Game of Thrones style cloak. I had this kind of big, kind of, you know, swanky, heavy cloak with fur and gold, and, you know, and it gave me a lot of status. I wandered around the world with this huge cloak on, going, you know, I am a kind of media, you know, I'm a kind of Murdoch media kind of baron. I mean, that sounds grim, but
I thought you were talking metaphorically, but you mean literally.
No, I was.
I thought you like metaphorically. I had my confidence cloak on.
I had my cloak. But it was kind of more than that, and what I realised when I had to give the cloak back, as it were, was that actually wearing that cloak comes with severe limitations. It's really heavy. It's very cumbersome. It's very obvious. So if you're wearing it, you have to behave in a certain way. So it kind of a whole load of things kind of stem from wearing that big heavy cloak. You know, good things in some ways, but also real limitations. And I think when I took it off for the first time in my adult life, I actually felt, to begin with, I just felt really sad, and I didn't know who I was, and I sat at home and binge watched The Crown and, you know, ate ice cream, and my children would come downstairs and go, what's the mum weather like today? You know, is it full on deluge? Is it like drizzle? You know, whatever, how much was I crying? So that, you know, that was definitely bad. But I soon began to realise that actually not wearing that thing gave me a real kind of lightness, a freedom to say whatever I liked, and that I'd also learned a lot of stuff while doing that job, you know, that actually all the stuff that I had been, I still was, but I didn't have to do it with this great big kind of cloak on. And actually, after I'd got over the sadness of it, and I did a lot of work on myself, I went and did lots of like silent yoga retreats, and I took a whole load of magic mushrooms in Jamaica, and
I did not think that was where that sentence was going, to be honest.
I love it.
I did
You are a mixed bag, and it's so good.
So I could suddenly do all sorts of stuff. You know, I could go and take loads of magic mushrooms and then write about it. I had a real kind of awakening. I became much more kind of in touch with my spiritual side. I did all sorts of wacky stuff that I would never have done in my old job with my cloak on. And that felt really fun and kind of really life enhancing. And I felt a much more kind of revivified, more real version of myself. I started meditating every day. I swam in the pond every day. I had a real life-changing kind of 3 years, and have come out the other side a rather different person.
I have an image of you just off your head on magic mushrooms in a pond. In Jamaica. In Jamaica.
There were moments like that.
I found myself. Here I am.
But Eleanor, if I can ask, did they give you a reason why you were made redundant? Because by all accounts, it sounds like your section was doing really well. Like it was not performance based.
Oh no, it wasn't performance based. It was entirely personal. You know, it was like my face didn't fit with the new lady. You know, I was out. There was no explanation given at all.
Did you feel resentful? Like, how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I did feel resentful. And I think that when that kind of thing happens, you get a kind of a slight PTSD response. So I found myself in subsequent months. I mean, like if you split up with somebody and your brain just kind of keeps going back to the moment where they go, I don't want to be with you anymore. Or, you know,
Like
it
what
was,
you
it was
should
that
say,
kind of thing.
replaying it over and over. What if I'd had this response or that response?
Exactly. You know, if I'd done this, or, you know, what was the point at which this thing became inevitable? A great friend of mine's husband died really tragically, and she said that she just kept going over and over and over the last movements. If she hadn't made that decision, then he wouldn't have been at the place where he died, you know, all those kind of things. So I think that there's that awful kind of working backwards. And one of the reasons that I started meditating and stuff was to get out of that very kind of ruminant loop about the kind of what ifs or the anxiety about what was to come. So I became very interested in how, you know, in this moment, actually everything is fine. I may be feeling worried about this or, you know, regretful about that, but actually, you know, in this moment, everything is okay. So it was like, how do I keep that sense of being here in this moment rather than being in the past or being anxious about the future? And that for me was the essence of coming into a sense of being in the now. And that's, you know, I meditate every morning, and I love that feeling when you get into the cold water as well. You can't think about anything else but exactly where you are. So I became very interested in that kind of practice of being very present.
Eleanor, it's so joyful hearing you talk about this almost like second chapter of your life. But it's so interesting to me. We did an interview with Trini Woodall a couple of months back,
Yeah.
and it's a fantastic episode. We'll link it in the show notes. But we were talking about this idea of the currency of the aging woman. And now, without any context around that, she was quite offended by it, and I understand why. But
Laura asked the question.
it's because we do seem to have this currency on ourselves as women of our value, of the value that we have. And I know we've touched on it, the value that you have when you're in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, and how that kind of seems to dwindle throughout our years. What are the steps that as women we can take to rewrite that? And whether that's rewriting our internalized misogyny, but what can we do to start to safeguard ourselves when we are in our 20s and in our 30s and still technically in our prime, to get to a point where we're okay with the fact that there is many phases of life as a woman, and turning 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 or whatever it is just another chapter in that. It doesn't devalue what you have to offer the world.
No, I mean, I would argue quite the contrary. So I would say that we come into our prime at 50. It's when we become the women we always wanted to be. It's when we've got the experience and the wisdom and the kind of self-knowledge, what I call being stout. And I feel very proud to be stout, to take up space in the world, to exhibit what I know, to speak out about the things that I care about. And I think that that quality of being very rooted in who and what you are and what you care about only comes with wisdom. And so I think that we need to really change the story that we tell about women and becoming, and start thinking that 50 is actually, you know, the beginning of that queen ager period between 50 and 75, where that's when we really reap the benefits of this long life that we've had and everything that's come before, when we can start maybe some kind of spiritual adventures, when we move into our personal power and can pass on that wisdom. I think that telling much more positive stories about what that feels like, what that can be like, is the antidote to the kind of sell-by-date-itis that you're talking about. And I've seen that, and what my book does is to tell the story of becoming of so many incredible women who have shifted into their power at 50. And if you think about the way that we've changed the story in our culture around race and around sexuality in the last kind of 20-30 years, we can do that about how we value women as they age. It really goes down to a very fundamental sense of what are women for? You know, we are not here to be pleasing to men, to be eye candy to men, to be handmaidens to the patriarchy, which is basically how our society tries to groom us. So I'm calling for a kind of stoutness, a sense of really embodying who and all of what we can be as women at this point, and making other younger women look forward to that. And that means bringing back examples of incredible strong women doing their thing at 50 and beyond, not just these kind of highly surgerized and kind of, you know, distorted visions of what women can be, about when they're hanging on to a kind of youth which is always going to be the law of diminishing returns. So I think we have to move into our power, and part of that is reclaiming the myths of the older wise women, which have been absolutely annihilated from our culture by Christianity and patriarchy over the last 2,000 years. One of the most interesting books I've read recently is something called Wise Women by a woman called Sharon Blackie, who's gone back and discovered all the myths of shape-shifting older women, the women who control the landscape, the women who weave fate, the hen wife who kind of helps the younger women in the village. There are all these incredible stories of what older women can be and their power. They've just been eradicated from our culture by patriarchy, and this is about bringing back that narrative.
That is so fascinating. I've never heard any of that. All I've kind of noticed is that there is this gaping hole, but I've never been aware that these stories existed, but they didn't serve the purpose of what the patriarchy was wanting. I mean, for people who might be interested in where they can find more of those sorts of stories or information around what used to exist, where might they be able to find that?
Well, there's this new volume of stories coming out, which is called Wise Women by Dr. Sharon Blackie, which is coming out later this year. She wrote a book called Haggitude as well, which also looks at some of the kind of visions of the crone. I'm not so crazy about this kind of, reclaiming cronehood or haggitude and stuff. I think that sounds a bit depressing. That's why I came up with the moniker of queenager. I think that feels a bit more enthusiastic, a bit more positive for women kind of 50 plus.
Has a bit more of a ring to it.
Yeah, a bit more zing.
Yeah, so I think it sounds, I'm a journalist. I've written headlines for a long time. I thought we needed a kind of positive
how it
brand.
works.
Make a spin.
I don't want to be a hag or a crone. I'm happy to be a queenager. But I think that's super important. And there are so many myths. I mean, in Scotland, there's the myth of the Cailleach, who inhabits the mountains. She's the kind of highest mountains, and she created the earth. We all live within her body. Or if you go to the ancient Greeks, that's the women who are the three fates who weave everybody's life. I was reading a wonderful Siberian folk tale the other day about this kind of transformation that comes to women at around 50, where a woman turns into a fox and suddenly kind of goes off into the forest and has a whole new life. And that's really what queenagerhood is about. It's like the research that we've done on my platform. We've done, I'm an old journalist, so I like some facts. And we did a huge study. And what we find is that really whatever we've been doing between 25 and 50, at about 50, it all changes. And yet in our culture, there's nothing saying expect this pivot point. As we live longer lives, we're all going to have to shift into a new phase. So if you've been at home with the kids leave home. If you've been doing a job, likelihood is, after 25 years, you're probably going to have to shift and do something else. Our parents die. People get divorced. We find that by 50, over half of women have been through at least 5 huge life events, which often come together in what we call a midlife collision or clusterfuck. And therefore, what that does is it's a kind of shedding, a bit like what happened to me, and you have to shed all the stuff that no longer serves you, and a bit like a pruning. When you cut a plant right back to its essence, you come out with this kind of wonderful green kind of shoot, a kind of new energy, a new purpose. That's why I have my bright green nails, to kind of remind me of that, which is like the kind of sap rising again. And I think we really need to tell this story in the culture. I think it's so important and kind of restorative and healing for so many women who are coming up behind us, that we don't have to believe the Disney tropes that the only older women are evil stepmothers and wicked witches.
You're so right.
Yeah, that actually there are so many amazing, kind, powerful, helpful older women out there who are just kind of, wanting to be given a chance, that we just need to tell a different story about them, which suits us as women, not the patriarchy.
Eleanor, what do you think's been your favourite decade?
Oh, I think I'm happier now than I've ever been. Truly. I really am. I'm 53. I've just, so 4 years ago, I kind of was drummed out of the Times, in tears walking out along the Thames. Last weekend, I was on the bestseller list. My book went in at number 4 on the Times bestsellers. Much more to come.
Well done.
So that was an amazing bit of circularity. And in fact, before it came out on the bestseller list, I'd gone back in to the Times building. They have this huge tower by the river. And my old friend, who's the top interviewer there, interviewed me on stage in front of a kind of big audience there, and they kind of really rolled out the red carpet. I went down to see the CEO and all that kind of stuff. And I felt that there's something very healing in things coming full circle. You said to me, am I bitter? No, it was very sad, and it was a real, massive thing to get my head around and to move out of. But actually, I think whatever form that midlife clusterfuck comes to you in. For me, it was redundancy. But I now run these circles of women. As part of Noon, we run a kind of monthly Queenager circle. We call it a Noon circle. We do them all over the UK now. And what I see when I sit in that circle and speak to the women is that everybody has this kind of reckoning in some ways. For me, it came through the redundancy. For others, it comes through divorce or a bereavement. Or for some people, nothing actually massive external happens, but how they feel totally changes, and they need to slough off a whole bit of their life and go off and do something else. So what I'm arguing for is a sense of the possibility of reinvention and coming into your new, most glorious chapter at 50. And that's what my book is all about. So much more to come. It's all about telling the stories of women who have done exactly that, and all the women who have inspired me on my own journey, and who are the absolute tapestry of this book, and all these incredible women I sit in the circles with every month.
Did you drop a signed copy back into your old boss's desk when you went back into the Sunday Times? That's what I would have done.
I did. The one who fired me, Watney, is now no longer there. She left after 2 years. But I did go back in to see the CEO there, who I've always been extremely fond of. And she said to me, Eleanor, are you really happier now? As if she found it really hard to think that. She said, I know you write in the book that you're happy now. And I was like, yeah, I really am, because I am entirely my own boss. Nobody can control what I say, or how I say it, or what I do within my company. And actually, for me now, the freedom as a kind of older, more powerful woman, the freedom to really call it as I see it, is now worth far more to me than that Game of Thrones cloak. Because nobody can control my voice or tell me to shut up, or to kind of stop me, and that, or edit me in any way. And that, it feels very, very like an amazing place to be. And I think that for women, the freeing of that voice only comes with pain. We have to, and fear. When I first started to write as me, rather than in the way that I'd been schooled to write by the paper for all those years, it came with a lot of kind of pain and anxiety. I'd literally be like trembling as I hit send on some of my posts. But coming through that, there's an amazing sense of kind of one's own power and the capacity to change the way people think, and to shift really shift the dial on this whole conversation in the world. And that's my real purpose now.
Eleanor, it's so, there are so many women who will listen to this who are our older demographic of women, and who will find the things that you're saying very affirming. But what I feel most excited about, it's because people who are in your place in life probably already understand and feel the way that you feel, and are seeking out a community of similar like-minded women. But I get really excited about the people who are my age, who feel fearful about aging or being older, and about their value within their workplace, their value within themselves, because they're still on that discovery, they're still on that self-journey towards it. And I have a question for you around something that has been recently in Australian media. It's been talked about a lot more. There's a lot of women who are at the forefront of this conversation, and it centers around menopause. It's probably the first time ever that I've started to actually see women publicly talking about menopause, and this almost like reframing of it. Do you think that it kind of has something to answer for in terms of how we've spoken about menopause for so long? Because I guess for me, everything up until recently, it's always been like, well, that's when you can no longer have children. And that's the most important thing as a woman, is being able to have children. So once you can't do it anymore, well, once again, the expiration date conversation. But I've been seeing a lot more around conversations around perimenopause, around, for some people, it feeling liberating. What has been your experience of this menopause conversation, and your experience of it, I guess?
Well, I try to talk about queenagers, not walking hot flushes, because for me, the entire point of feminism was for us to be freed from our biology. Yeah. So while I think it's incredibly important that the menopause conversation comes out of the shadows and isn't kind of is no longer part of a taboo, and that doctors know how to help us if we're having bad symptoms, and about 25% of women really suffer, I also think it's really important that we don't put all older women into this kind of hot flush, kind of menopausal, slightly kind of
hormonal,
bonkers kind of hormonal box, I actually think that's really dangerous. I think that that's a bit like taking us back to Victorian times when women were seen as kind of hysterical because they were ruled by their wombs and their hormones, so they weren't fit to take any decisions. Women were seen like children or dogs, as not really mentally proficient. So I think that there's a reason why a patriarchal culture has been so enthusiastic to embrace putting all older women in a hot pink sweaty menopause box. So I think it's quite old. So while I welcome the fact that there's some older women kind of speaking out about this, and I think the menopause is obviously a big thing, the danger of this conversation is it makes everybody think that they're going to have a terrible menopause, because the women who tend to speak about it are the ones who've had a really bad time, understandably. But the reality is that for about 3/4 of women, it's a bit uncomfortable, you get a bit hot, which has been my experience, but it's fine. I don't take HRT. I find if I swim in the pond every day, I feel okay. If I don't drink alcohol, I'd feel okay. So I don't think it's a kind of, I think for some women, they really, really feel awful and they get very depressed and they have, bad symptoms. But I think to put a message out there into society for younger women that, okay, you've just battled through, your periods, having children, maybe if you have them, kind of, you got to this point, and then you're going to get whacked over the head with menopause. I don't think that is a massively positive way of framing women's lives and what we're for. So while I welcome it in some ways, and particularly the medical stuff, I mean, I'm a great believer in the Caroline Criado Perez stuff about invisible women, and it's really important that doctors actually understand and are trained in menopause. In the UK, it wasn't mandatory to have training for GPs in menopause till about 18 months ago. So,
crazy,
that's really important, the health equity piece. But I think it's also really important that we don't play into that trap, and often that's the problem with misogyny. It doesn't go away, it mutates into a different form. And while I think the menopause conversation is important, I don't want to be seen through a menopausal lens
100%,
in the same way that I don't want to be seen through a male lens. And actually, we did a big study with our ladies at Noon on this, and 80% of the women don't want to be defined as menopausal. They want doctors to know what they're doing, but they don't want to be seen through that lens, because that's why I talk about queenagers, menopause, of course, is a part of the experience at this time. But if you think of it like a pie chart, the menopause is like one kind of slither of that pie chart, whereas this midlife collision is much more about it, I think, and also the gendered ageism in the culture, and also I think a sense that of women themselves just getting to a point of what we call the midlife revolt, which is just going, I just can't be asked to be pleasing anymore, I don't need to fit into these stereotypes, I'm gonna wear purple and kind of go my own way, or whatever that is. So I just think that the menopause conversation can be quite reductive, and so I resist the menopausal lens. Someone said to me the other day, "Hey Eleanor, are you in the Menopause?" I was like, no, shoot me in the head.
But menopausal as a label is so deeply intertwined with hormonal, and it's so reductive in that sense, and like
it's so pejorative.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's not a compliment, is it? I mean, and in the same way, I wouldn't say to my daughters, "Oh, darlings, you're menstrual." No one defines young women as being menstrual. And I said this at Adweek the other day, but you wouldn't go to a whole room of middle-aged men and go, "Oh, welcome to your Viagra years. How's the limp dick club?" I mean, it's the same thing.
It truly is.
So let's not put women in that kind of menopausal kind of hormonal box. Let's see them as the amazing kind of creatures that they are, queenagers, not walking hot flushes.
Almost am going to want to disagree with something you said there. Just the part where I think the opposite. I think we do label hormonal, and I think it's okay for women in terms of when they're menstruating, because science says we are more hormonal, we are more emotional, and like I think it's okay to say that, like, hey, I'm sorry, I actually do have my period right now. Not apologizing, but like I know things are heightened for me right now. I think there is something to be said for having some self-awareness around that. So it's not an excuse and it's not a label, but our bodies do change at that time.
I guess the thing though is with that, Britt, is that doesn't need to be said, because it's overcorrected so far. It's already used as
I say it all the time.
But it's already used by people as a weapon. So people don't need to be reminded that, yes, I have hormones that do sometimes affect the way I feel about things. I'm cognizant of that. Don't diminish what I say when I feel a certain way because of it. And I think it's weaponized. And that's what happens with menopause as well. It's just another thing that's used to weaponize the way in which and reduce the way in which women feel.
I completely agree. So I totally agree with you that we should be allowed to say that, we're in pain. I had terrible periods, and it used to make me really, really emotional, and I'd have a few days where I really just needed to go to bed. And I think it's really important that women are now able to say that in the workplace. One of my great friends is a woman called Gabby who set up Bloody Good Periods. So I totally, and I'm also a really, I'm a huge believer that women who are discriminated against at work for menopause or have really bad symptoms and all those kind of things should get the support that they need. I really, 100% believe that. But it's about the lens through which we're seen through. You may have a few days a month where you feel, emotional, hormonal. And of course, in an ideal world, we'd be able to kind of express that and that would be understood. But I think the world that we live in still weaponizes any female weakness against us so massively. That's the kind of mutation of misogyny. So we kind of think that we're getting something which is positive for us and then it's weaponized against us. So I just think that we always have to be aware of that and aware of the historical precedent, which is that women are seen as hysterical, hormonal, and therefore, less than and less fit to lead. And I think that, we were talking about female CEOs. I think there's also a real danger within the corporate world. I do a lot of work now as a consultant and trying to get companies to think about how many senior women they've got and to hang on to them. But I think that there's also a danger there that the menopause conversation puts us in a kind of sweaty menopausal hot flush box, just when we should be being kind of stepping into leadership positions. So I'm just very wary of anything that diminishes female power through a biological lens. Not to say that it's nuanced, isn't it? It's both.
It definitely just comes back full circle to education. The reason people put into that box is because they're not educated enough to know that it doesn't have to impact someone's life. Like, it doesn't have to define us. But that comes with conversations like we're having right now.
Yeah, for sure. And these things are it's never completely kind of black and white. There's some right on both sides. But I think that what tends to happen when we're talking about women is that any kind of weakness that we admit to is then weaponized and used against us. So I'm just wary of that, because I've seen that happen with the menopause space so much, whether it's about big brands cashing in on kind of menopause lines of like cotton shirts. It's like, actually, I'm an intelligent woman, I know that probably cotton is a good idea, it doesn't need to have a menopause label on it, so that kind of thing. So there becomes a kind of corporate jumping on the bandwagon, and it always slightly makes me cringe when I go to a conference and I see some very powerful woman standing up and like feeling like she has to talk about her menopause, that's kind of now expected in a way that a man never would. So I think that it's always kind of worth looking at the equivalents, and I think the Viagra one is quite a good one. We don't say to the senior chaps, on the little blue pills, in the way that women talk about HRT. And I think the other thing that's important for us to mention in the context of this conversation is that if we think about the witch trials, I think that they are actually we were talking about kind of women being pitted against women. It's just important to remember the church and society went through a phase where they killed women, they drowned them or they burnt them for being friendly with other women, or for being interested in kind of, natural cures, or for being midwives, or for being slightly weird, or women who were living on their own on the edge of the village. They actually were killed within, the last kind of 150 years. So within our kind of genetic memory, it's been very dangerous to be an outlying woman who supports other women. So when I talk about the kind of, when you speak up, you have that kind of sense of fear, that's very real and recent. If you think about women in Iran, or Malala, who was, shot at for saying that she had the right to be educated. All of this stuff is very new. What I'm talking about, in much more to come, is the latest phase. I think the last bit of feminism, kind of one of the last bits of the argument that needs to be made. And it's only 100 years since women got the vote. So this is an ongoing revolution. It's probably going to take hundreds of years for us to really get to equality. So I'm just trying to spell out the places which we're only just beginning to think about. And so all of these things hopefully will come out in the wash. We'll have a truly equal society where the fact that we feel emotional or we're menopausal or whatever won't be held against us. But I think currently we're still very much at the beginning of that trajectory, and to say to women that we've got equality is entirely to gaslight them. We haven't. We're at the beginning. It's like we've been given the lanyard, we're allowed into the building, but it's not set up for us yet.
Eleanor, you would be in all sorts of trouble on psychedelics in the pond back in the day. If you were 100 years ago, you would be fucked, put it that way.
Oh, I would definitely have been thrown I would definitely have been burnt at the stake. I'm very happy to be a witch.
I have found this conversation so incredibly fascinating. I for myself, I have felt a shift in, I'm 38 now. I think when I was in my 20s, I was quite fixated on the things that I thought were important, which were the way that I looked, the way in which men validated my existence, the things that I could provide in a work sense, but not from my own fulfillment, from like a sense of like seeking external validation perspective. And I have seen a shift, and it's a growing shift in me. I'm certainly not where I want to be, but I'm heading towards that in a sense of comfort and ease in the person that I am. And with that has come like a real sense of confidence that I didn't have 5 years ago or 6 years ago. But I love speaking to you and love hearing that it doesn't just stop one day. You don't just reach a destination and then have to rework yourself from the ground up. Because, you know, even when I said earlier, prime years of your life, and for you to overcorrect me and say, actually, I think the prime years of my life now, I take a real comfort in that, because I think for a long time I was scared about aging, and I don't feel fearful anymore, not just from this conversation, but from where I'm heading towards. And I think a lot of people, there's a comfort to getting there, that's for sure.
I'm still scared. We're not there yet.
You haven't read my book yet.
Eleanor, I'd love to finish with just your favourite piece of advice that you can impart on us, or maybe someone's imparted on you over the years.
I think the most helpful thing that anyone said to me when I was going through my own kind of dark midlife kind of transition, well, the American midlife guru Chip Conley says midlife is not a crisis but a chrysalis, and I think that that's really important, that sense of you're going into something and you're going to come out, you know, as a butterfly. I think that's really helpful. But actually the most helpful thing anyone said to me was change is difficult. I was in a Qigong class and I was at the end and I felt really emotional and I was crying, and this lovely teacher just said to me, you know, and he said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going through a big transition." He said, "You know, it's okay, change is difficult." And I think giving ourselves permission to be finding it hard, for me, that was the most liberating thing. That it was like, for the first time, I allowed a bit of self-compassion to come in. Like, you know, this is hard, I'm doing my best. And kind of saying to people when they're in a bad way, "Oh, you know, buck up, it'll all be fine, it'll be the making of you," which is what people tend to do, or "you'll bounce back," you know. That's meant kindly. But actually, when you're in that place, just to be met, to be heard, and to be told that you're allowed to be finding it unbearably tough is kind of what I really needed to hear. And that allowed in, you know, a bit of the beginning of the healing process, that it was going to be a process. Change is difficult, it takes a while, you have to be kind to yourself, you have to do things in a different way. And so I think that's the key message, but that change is difficult, but we have to keep on doing it, and we need to expect it, particularly if we're going to live the 100-year life. We're going to have to keep changing. Nothing's going to stay the same. It's the only constant.
Eleanor, you're wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Much more to come. Your book is out now. We're going to link that in our show notes along with your website and all your other info. But you have been truly wonderful. Like,
I've loved this chat.
You have made a pretty tough topic very, very palatable. Like, very funny, very easy to listen to, and quite inspirational.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really flattered and honoured to be on your podcast, and I just really hope, my real purpose now is to spread this message so that women don't feel like they have a sell-by day. You know, we really don't, and we come into our power and our prime at this point, and that's the message.